So is it fair to say that, you know what? Maybe it's fair to kind of revisit that debate about the Lions investing in Jahmyr Gibbs and Sam Laporta and Jamison Williams in the first round of the draft, and also, using first and second round picks for skill position players as opposed to invest in the trenches until you found that piece opposite of Aiden Hutchinson. Because as of now, the Lions are still looking for that player. You tried James Houston in the later rounds. That didn't work. You tried Broderick Martin, but he's more of a developmental player, and in 2 years, you got nothing out of him. You drafted a backup quarterback that has not really done much, that also could have been used on a defensive lineman. So I do think it's fair to look at. My opinion is that I like how the Lions have built. I think that you took chances on guys that are going to be contributors for a long time. I think Jahmyr Gibbs is going to be one of the top three running backs. You maybe have your Saquon Barkley. And I do think that Jamison Williams is a player that, as long as he keeps his head on right, I think that he's going to develop into a home run threat. So there are multiple ways to build in the National Football League. But when you do peek at what the Eagles did, that's kind of a nice formula to say, hey, there's a balance of calculated risks, trading draft picks, signing a player that puts you over the top. Now, the player that put them over the top was Saquon Barkley. I don't think, and here's my point. Unfortunately, yes, Myles Garrett would help, but I don't think that's the final piece. You don't have enough still, even with Myles Garrett, because you got to remember, Ali McNeil's coming back from an injury. DJ Reader's going to be a little bit older. The depth along the interior, not good enough yet to be championship caliber. So even with Aiden Hutchinson, Myles Garrett, Ali McNeil, you don't have enough depth along the defensive line and the offensive line to compete and win a Super Bowl. Is that fair or foul to say, wait a minute, the way in which the Eagles developed might be something that you may need to kind of emulate if you want to reach the opportunities to maybe get to a couple Super Bowls and win one?
Yeah, it's interesting that it's kind of a unique revisionist history, and obviously the Eagles are getting their due, and Howie Roseman's done a great job building this team, obviously, and they won the Super Bowl. Like they deserve to have this conversation about how more teams should be like the Eagles. But I do think what the Lions have done is a little unique. And I think that if we go back and we say, well, the Lions should have done this, well, they did draft Aiden Hutchinson second overall. Like there's one guy that they've invested in. They drafted Josh Pascal in the second round. The year before that, they drafted Levi Onwuzurike in the second round. They drafted Aleem McNeil in the third round. So within the first 3 rounds, you've invested a lot in your defensive line. And the thing is you want to revisit whether or not they should have taken Jahmyr Gibbs and Sam Laporta where they took them. And that's a completely understandable argument because of positional value and all those things. But I would argue that the Lions would not be what they are right now without some of these skill guys. Like when you take into the impact that Jahmyr Gibbs has on their offense, like take him out and replace him with a defensive lineman, and then now your offense isn't as explosive, and you have to count on that draft pick to hit at 12 overall. Like I don't know, the revisionist history just doesn't do a whole lot for me because the Lions they got to 15-2 with the way they constructed the roster right now. It wasn't enough to win the Super Bowl this year, but you also have to take into account the fact that they turned the ball over 5 times in that game. And, unless you make the swap at quarterback, which they're not going to do, the 5 turnover game isn't something you draft. Like this is a complete. The reason they lost in the divisional round was because they didn't show up. Right? I don't think I'm wrong in that aspect. After being a team that really took care of the ball all throughout the regular season, the biggest game of the year, they turned it over 5 times. And to me, that's not something you draft. You just have to be ready for those big moments. And so I think the Lions have done as good a job of any of drafting their core to this point in Brad Holmes' tenure. When you talk about Sewell and Hutchinson and Gibbs and Campbell's coming along, I'm telling you, in another couple of years, I think he's going to be a mainstay for that defense right in the middle, depending on how long the Lions stick with Alex Anzalone. And then you talk about guys like Jamison Williams and Aleem McNeil. Amon-Ra St. Brown was a 4th-round pick in 2021. If they choose to bring Derek Barnes back, he'll be a part of the big part of the defense. Brian Branch was a 2nd-round pick in 2023. Like, they've done well in the draft. Let's not get that misconstrued. Now, you could argue that they could have devoted these resources to maybe fortifying the trenches a little bit, but they have taken swings on defensive linemen, guys like Pascal, where Pascal's pretty good against the run. We're still waiting for the pass rush production heading into year 4. Onwuzurike's been hurt, but the potential is there. He's an interesting decision for the Lions this offseason. And then guys later in the draft, like James Houston, where he had an amazing rookie season or second half of his rookie season, and then it just hasn't worked out from there. So the Lions have devoted resources to the defensive line. It just maybe hasn't necessarily panned out as quickly as the Eagles have. And I think that the way they've drafted has made them what they are, because they've drafted players who fit their scheme and fit their culture. And a lot of these guys, when you look back on the last 4 years, as I am right now, these are guys that are huge contributors for them. And so I think the draft isn't necessarily the issue. I think, the overwhelming message for the Lions this year is when you're on the biggest stage, you got to show up, and you can't turn the ball over 5 times and expect to win. And they've got a lot of pieces in place, but you have to execute on these big games. And the Eagles played their best game of the year on the biggest stage, and that's the way it's got to be. And you could argue the game before that against the Commanders was their best game of the year. And then against the Rams, they did enough to win in the snow and the conditions and all that. But this is a team that elevated its game in the postseason. I believe they were plus 13 in turnover differential in the playoffs, which, wild card, divisional round, championship game, Super Bowl, that's 4 games. And you were plus 13 in turnover differential. Like, I think there's on-field elements of this that need to be taken into account when you talk about doing things the Eagles way. I know that was super long-winded. But again, I think there's a lot that goes into it. And I think the draft is a little bit lower on my concerns because I think the Lions have done well.